Hello, everybody, and welcome to Biotensegrity Party number 16. This week, we're featuring a discussion of how human performance can benefit from an understanding of biotensegrity. And we're so happy you're here to join us. I'm Chris Morita Clancy, coming to you from Deep Cove in North Vancouver. That's on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish. And I am here with my co-host, Susan Lowell de Soloranzo, in Washington, D.C. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone.
Our fellow co-host, Graham Scarr, is off this week. We're going to move on and say hello to Technical Director Mariana Barreto. Hi, Mariana.
Hi. Hello, everyone.
To Rachel Tudor. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Hey, Rachel.
And to Lisa Babiak. Hey, Lisa.
Hi.
So we're so grateful to have you on our Biotensegrity Party team. This is a completely volunteer-run event. It's turned out to be a weekly event, and we couldn't do it without you. And of course, we couldn't do it without all of you here who have come to support us and join us. Today, we're joined by our guest co-host, Wilbur Kelsek. Wilbur, where are you? Hi, Wilbur. Are you there? Oh, there he is. Will you say something, Wilbur, so that everybody can...
Hello, everybody. Hello, Neil and Carol and Steve and everybody here.
Wilbur, that mic is still a little too close to your mouth. You're fuzzing. There we go.
How about that? Is that better?
That's much better.
All
Thanks,
right.
Wilbur. Wilbur is coming to us from Port Moody outside of Vancouver. We're practically neighbors. And we're also across the water. Across the water. So we're also joined by Jen Wilson from Derby in Midlands, England. Hi, Jen.
Hi, I'm actually in the Lake District this weekend, so a bit further north.
Oh, okay. I took that from our conversation on Tuesday in the Lake District. Very nice. Hope you enjoy it. And from Brian Murer in Bloomington, Indiana. Where are you here on my screen, Brian? If you say something, everybody can find you there. Thanks, Brian. And Joe Przytula, who is from the greater New York area, Elizabeth, New Jersey. Joe, where are you here?
Hey, Joe.
Hi, Joe. If you unmute and say hi, we'll all be able to find you on our screen.
Hi, everybody. Okay.
Hi. Thanks for being here. So before we start our discussion about biotensegrity and athletic performance, today is a very special day. Today it's Steve's birthday, 88 years young. And,
Whoa.
and got you, Steve. So Dr. Stephen Levin is the father of biotensegrity. He is a beloved mentor to many of us. And so let's have a special birthday toast for Steve. Mariana, will you do the honors?
Of course, yes, of course. So everyone, get your cup of your beverage wherever you're taken, and let's give this to Dr. Steve for what he's doing. I think the legacy that is living, and it's simply amazing the work that he has done, and we are so happy to just carry that for the rest of the world. So cheers for Dr. Steve. And cheers for this Biotensegrity Party number 16.
Cheers. Thank you, Mariana. So we have great guests and a fantastic program today. This is going to be our first discussion on biotensegrity in sports, and I suspect we'll have many more to follow. Now, if you're here with us on YouTube or on Zoom, we want to know more about you. You're part of this biotensegrity community. So if you type in who you are, where you are in the world, and what is your interest in biotensegrity, we're always saving those chats. Over the weeks of this event, we're getting to know people, and we love that. So whether it's on Zoom or on YouTube, please let us know who you are, where you're from, and we've got someone monitoring those chats. This is also the place to put your questions. We like to start with some presentation, and Wilbur is going, as our co-host, is going to be facilitating the panel discussion. And then at about the 45-minute mark, I believe it's going to be, we'll start to bring up the questions that you ask. So please do that. But first, Rachel, can you tell us a little bit more about the Biotensegrity Tea Party and our sponsors?
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Like Chris said, our Biotensegrity Party is an all-volunteer production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive, and you can find that at biotensegrityarchive.org. And as I say these, I think Lisa will be posting them in the chat as well. Thanks, Lisa. This is made possible in part through generous support from our sponsors, starting with Handspring Publishing in East Lothian, Scotland. They're producers of highly accessible, easily applied research-based material for movement and manual therapy professionals. And their amazing team see publishing as an art, as well as a science. For them, it's a human and intellectual enterprise, as well as a business. And they offer a generous discount coupon to those on the Biotensegrity Archive mailing list and to our Zoom participants. And you'll find that in our chat here as well. We're also generously supported by Chris Clancy's educational organization, which is Embodied Biotensegrity in Vancouver, British Columbia. So for those of you looking to learn more about Biotensegrity, Chris's programs are an excellent resource, which I can say from personal experience. The membership group Biotensegrity Trailblazers meets twice a month. For example, just on this past Tuesday, the Biotensegrity Book Club discussed papers by Jen Wilson and John Kiley and Stephen Levin. And we were lucky enough to be joined by Jen and Dr. Steve, which was amazing. Prices are going up in September, by the way, so join now. The Biotensegrity Tea Party is also sponsored by Artifact Pro of Madrid, Spain, where you can find beautiful and wonderfully constructed tensegrity models, including models of the spine and the pelvis. Artifact Pro also offers a generous discount coupon to our viewers on the Biotensegrity Archive mailing list and to our Zoom participants, and we're very grateful for that. And finally, we're very kindly supported by
Something happened. Oh, there we go, you're back.
Did I go away?
Yeah, we muted you for, somehow you got muted. So if you, she was on the British Fascia Symposium, right?
Okay, great. That's the last one anyway. Okay, great. So finally, we're kindly supported by the British Fascia Symposium in the UK, which not only organizes their biannual BFS event, but several other exciting programs, so check them out as well. And back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Rachel. So now we're going to move over towards our panel discussion, and it will be and if you'll please, if you're an audience member, turn your video off. That gives a better screen view for the YouTube Live. And so our panel members, please leave yours on. I'd like to begin by introducing our guest host, Wilbur Kelsek. I'm happy to say hello, Wilbur. Great to see you again. Wilbur is an active member of the Biotensegrity community. He regularly attends the big meetings in Europe. BIG stands for Biotensegrity Interest Group, and the Biotensegrity Informed Dissection in Dundee. That's run by John Sharkey with Joanne Avison. I think you've been to all of those, Wilbur, or most of them, yeah?
Most of them, yeah.
And Wilbur shares, whenever I try and get a hold of him, he's usually traveling around the world, sharing Biotensegrity with all of the people that he's interacting with and at seminars and such. Wilbur's a chiropractor, and he includes specialization in elite athletic performance and rehabilitation in his work using applied functional anatomy. He is a faculty member of the Department of Graduate Studies at the Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College. And Wilbur has worked as team doctor at the Olympics, at World Championships, and the Commonwealth Games. Wilbur, we're happy you're here to share your expertise with us, with all of us, and to facilitate our panel discussion on biotensegrity and athletic performance. Why don't you take it away from here?
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for your generous note about some of my dealings. And first of all, it's an honor to be part of this group and to be asked to facilitate this very what I think is going to be exciting presentation with talking about sports and how biotensegrity sort of is now taking leaps and bounds in the field of sports and in the field of human movement and in the field of rehabilitation and diagnosis. And I'm excited about the discussion today, and I hope that you know, we have lots of questions and lots of discussions. What I want to do at the beginning is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you a couple of slides just to introduce the topic. And are we ready? So, can we see that, Chris? Can
Yeah, that's
everybody see my
great.
Chris? Yes. All right. So basically, we don't talk about biotensegrity and clinical applications. And by the way, happy birthday, Steve. I hope I look as good as you when I'm 88.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, you're healthy, wise, and your mind is so strong. I hope my mind can stay that strong. Anyways, when we talk about biotensegrity in sports, I mean, you know, every sport is different in its application, in the way that it presents itself, in the movement pattern. And basically, the way I like to look at biotensegrity is that it's a principle that you can apply to basic human movement. And I should just give a little bit about my journey. I mean, I've been working in sports for a very long time, and I sort of did things based on the results I got. If I got good results, I would keep doing it. If I didn't get results, I would try something else. I would talk to practitioners, older practitioners who have more experience. I would talk to coaches, and I would see how they do things that make sense, and some things didn't make sense. So I mean, I was always searching for answers in terms of, okay, what works, what doesn't work? Well, this doesn't make sense based on the anatomy that I knew back then, you know, 35 years ago, you know, practicing the way they taught us anatomy. Some things made sense and a lot of things didn't make sense, but we go on what they teach us. So I came from that school where we were taught certain things. I didn't know anything about biotensegrity, but there's one thing that I which sort of stuck in my mind is that whatever tissue that we were working with, and that time I called it connective tissue, I always says, connective tissue is a very interesting tissue because it has an infinite ability to adapt and to adapt instantaneously to whatever we're doing. And I remember writing that in a textbook back in 1988 or something. I can't remember the year, but that's all I knew. I knew nothing about fascia. Well, I knew about the plantar fascia and I knew about the thoracolumbar fascia. So it was kind of an interesting journey for me. And then, you know, working with coaches and working with very high level coaches over the years, and because I was interested in sports and track and field and wrestling, I noticed that some coaches were doing some very interesting things. And I figured they learned those things from other coaches, and they learned them from maybe the athletes, from their techniques not working and trying different things. And this was very interesting. But some of the explanations that they would use sometimes didn't tie into my anatomy and to my biomechanics at that time that I knew. And then I end up in learning about the fascia group in Ohm and started working there and going to the workshops and attending the fascia symposium and attending the summer school and meeting Robert Slipe. And then we started talking about, there's something called fascia. And then at that time also I was introduced to biotensegrity from that concept. And reading about some of Steve's work back then when I heard about biotensegrity, when I looked it up, and Dr. Levin's name came up, and Inberger and all of these different people, I started learning about that, and Danielle and so forth. So it was kind of an interesting journey there. I didn't meet Dr. Levin till I met him in person in Washington, D.C., and it was introduced to me by Joanne Avison, which keep telling me about it. I met Joanne in Ohm University, and she was telling me about, you know, Dr. Levin, and I said, well, I have to meet this guy, and we eventually met in person, and thanks to Joanne. And so the rest is basically history in terms of how I look at sports and the importance that I think that I had this aha moment, you know, in terms of, oh, that's what's happening. This makes sense. And biotensegrity for me then made complete sense in terms of a discipline that can explain the behavior of living tissue in humans as well as in plants. And once I had that under my belt, that kind of concept on which I'm still learning some of it, I should say, I was able to now get creative and get fancy in trying to understand things and trying to start applying different principles in terms of body movement and body form, and that made it a lot of fun. And then I was able to talk to coaches and explain to them, well, you know, maybe this is a better explanation for what you're doing, and that's why you're getting these results. And they were able to then use this thing, to use these methods to improve their performance. And actually, one of my mentors, Brian knows one of my mentors, and he's one of his mentors also, Dan Paff. I met Dan Paff back in the day when he worked with Donovan Bailey and a few other guys in '96 Olympics around that time. And Dan is a great mentor to me because he understood mechanics, he understood running and athletics. And I mean, some of his explanations again were one of those things, but he understood it and it worked for him. And he was such an inspiration in terms of his knowledge, and in some of my athletes that he worked with and so forth. So this is sort of my journey. But one of the things I want to say today is that our mandate here is to provide a safe place for discussion. And I want everybody to be relaxed and every idea is a good idea. Don't be sort of shy to bring up your idea. I want you to feel safe. You know, I want you to be mentally be present and to be able to be respectful of different opinions. And this is what the Biotensegrity group is about. And for the new people, this is for the new people coming on. So going back to sort of the different type of sports and how biotensegrity affects is that we know there's different forces in the body, and the forces in the body, the way they act, depends on the type of sport that you're doing. And there are different body types, you know, for the same sports, like even in running, they're bigger guys, they're mesomorphs, they're endomorphs, you know, it all varies. And when we look at swimming, for example, it's a different discipline. And the way that we look at swimmers and the way that we examine swimmers are totally different than how I would examine a runner. And this is all based on the knowledge that I've been learning about biotensegrity. And one of the things that's the key for me in terms of looking at athletes is that I developed this concept, what I call FET. You know, how do I look at an athlete? I look at an athlete in terms of their form, which is very important. I look at an athlete in terms of their emotion, because for me, emotion is very important in terms of how does the athlete present? You know, what do they look like today? How can I how much should we load them? I have to communicate that with the coach, or maybe we can't do the workout today, or we can only do half of the workout. And then we look at terms of task, the movement, the sort of movement patterns that's involved, and how is that involved, and what are the different things that we have to do to accentuate or to make that movement pattern more efficient. And that's where biotensegrity really comes in. You know, the athlete is not just two legs. I know a lot of coaches just kind of repeat things other coaches do, but an athlete has emotion, they have spirit, they have energy, and we can't treat them like two legs. And we have to treat the athletes as a whole. And as a practitioner, I find myself, I have to be in tune and directly connected to my athletes, right? I look at something called tensegral posture, right? The posture that's necessary in terms of the way your body presents itself, you know, when things are engaged and you're present, you know. So tensegrity is not just a physical thing. It has a lot of emotional stuff tied to it, you know. Body language for me is huge in terms of how we look at things. And we understand that your body shapes, you know, who you are in terms of what you present as. And for me as a practitioner, that's important. And the other thing that I find helpful with biotensegrity is that I have to be on the field. I have to be there with the practitioners. I have to be there with the coaches, sorry, not the practitioners, with the coaches, listening to what they want done. How can I influence what the demands are? How can I influence the athlete? What cues I have to give to the athlete to enhance the tensegral form and the tensegral position. So being on the field, I think, for people who believe in biotensegrity and working with people is absolutely important. You need to see things in motion, and not just by video camera, but actually see what's going on. And where are the forces? We know about lines and all of the stuff. We know those things are sort of not totally true, but we have to see form to understand. So I want to stop here, and then I would like to introduce, we have very interesting speakers here. We have Jen, we have Joseph, and we have Brian. And I'd like to bring on the rest of my panel, give them an opportunity to say what they are doing in their field. We have interesting fields in aesthetic behavior of tissue. We have physical education specialists. So it's going to be very interesting. And I would like you to just, the panelists. And who wants to go first, Joe or Jen? Not Joe, sorry, Jen, I think, is who will have go first to discuss, to start saying a little bit about herself. And then we'll go to Brian and then Joe.
Thanks, Wilbur. That's a really a tough act to follow, I think. So my name's Jen Wilson. I lecture at the University of Derby, and I teach predominantly on our sports therapy and injury rehabilitation courses and our strength conditioning and rehabilitation courses. So my main interest is about injury risk reduction, or what we consider to be rehabilitation. And actually, I got introduced to Biotensegrity quite a while ago, actually via James Earls. And at the time, I had this concept where I thought I understood it, but it was something that I shelved. And then I came back to it when I started writing my thesis a few years ago, and published a paper with my supervisor, John Kiley. And the reason that I love Biotensegrity as a framework or as a concept, in athletic conditioning, we have lots of terminology that we use. So the conversation we had a couple of days ago was this term stiffness. We talk about tissue stiffness, but we also talk about leg stiffness, and we also talk about joint stiffness. And they can mean lots of different things, but the kind of beautiful thing for me about the Biotensegrity as a concept is it brings everything together in terms of what we talk about in athletic conditioning, in terms of energy proficiency, robustness. And one thing that I wanted to pick up on what Wilbur said is he was talking about the athletes, and to me, the best athletes are always the ones that look like they move effortlessly, so they can channel into utilizing this nice elastic energy, and they make things look fluid, and they make things look pretty when they do it. And as I said, I think for me, the Biotensegrity framework is a really fantastic way of looking at athletic movement and athletic conditioning. So I'm very much at the start of my journey into Biotensegrity. I'm looking forward to seeing what everyone has to say and what everyone presents on their topics. But happy to answer any questions on the foot and Biotensegrity for sure.
Hang on, Wilbur, you're muted. Wilbur, you're muted. Hang on. Are you unmuting yourself? We can't hear you.
Myself. Here we go.
There we go. Awesome.
All right. Yes, so Jen, that's so important. I mean, you use a word there for me that's for me in Biotensegrity means a lot, and it's fluidity. And movement is about fluidity. It's about what I consider to be rhythm. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, because without a rhythm, whether it's slow or fast, things are not fluid. And if we take the body as soft matter, well, soft matter has a fluidity behavior to its existence. So we go on to Brian now. Brian, come on, give us your stuff.
Thanks, Wilbur. Thanks for having me. I've been involved. I'm classically trained as a chiropractor in the U.S. here. I consider myself more of a manual therapist. In the past 7 years or so, I've been training more with classically trained European osteopaths. That was where I really took hold of the Biotensegrity concept. I learned a little bit about it in school. And like Wilbur said, before I went to chiropractic school, I was an athletics or track and field coach, and my coaching mentor was Dan Paff. I had the great fortune to spend about 24 months on the track with him when I was learning to be a coach. And when you're watching the likes of Kareem Street Thompson, Donovan Bailey, Obadeli Thompson, Bruni Surin, watching those guys train every day, you get quite a catalog of movement literacies for athletes. And I didn't quite have the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to understand or categorize what was happening. But as I got introduced to Steve's work and studied it a little further, really, when you're applying biotensegrity to athletics, you only really have to stop with Steve's original papers. And I think when there's no shearing moments in a biotensegral system, and load is distributed evenly throughout a biotensegral system, I think you can stop right there, and that'll give you plenty to ponder when you're on the track or on the field or in the training room with an athlete. And that really started to give them some names to what I saw on the track years ago. In particular, right now, I had the great fortune 2 years ago to be in one of Steve's master classes, and he talked about this concept that biotensegrity systems act auxetically, or all tensegrity systems act auxetically. And I had spent quite a bit of time studying with the French osteopath Guy Voyer and learning his versions of myofascial stretching and his Aldoa techniques. And as an athlete, I knew they just felt different, and I didn't know why. And when I learned about auxetic behavior of biotensegrity systems, that really piqued my curiosity. And yeah, so that's where I am right now with tensegrity.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Brian, you like myself are so fortunate that people don't understand the importance of somebody like Dan Paff in the world of sport, and not just in track and field, in his understanding. And he's one of the first coaches, I think, who really, grasps the concept of multiple muscle systems, which is what we used to call it in the day. We never talked about force transmission back then. We talk about multiple muscle systems, which actually governs the same concept that, like he's explained in Graham's book and what Steve talked about, the 4-bar system. This is basically, we didn't have the language to explain them. But Dan was one of the guys who actually started discussing that with me back then about multiple muscle system, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But thank you so much for I'm so excited to have you here today, and you can shed some light on some of your work and to explain to us how you view things. So now we go on to Joe. So Joe, we would like you to say a few words and do your presentation, and then we'll head into some more discussion.
Okay, I'm going to hold on while I share my screen here. Hold that up. Can everybody see my screen yet?
Not yet, Joe.
Hold on a second here. Okay.
It's coming.
Okay.
There we go. We see not just your main slide, but also along.
Hey, Joe, where'd you get that picture?
Oh.
There we go.
Okay. This look good? Okay. All right. So I thought I'd frame my discussion by talking about how biotensegrity frames my practice. First of all, I'm the physical education supervisor. Elizabeth Public Schools is the biggest school district in New Jersey. I was also still am the athletic trainer there for over 30 years. And I have a picture of George Blanda up there because Brian bet me that I couldn't get my presentation done in under 10 minutes. And being that I am the last presenter, George Blanda was an ex-football quarterback, and he used to come in at the end of the game, and his team, the Oakland Raiders, were usually down by a couple points, and he was always able to kind of punch the ball across the goal line. And I know today, you youngins out there, you got your Lionel Messi and your Tom Brady. Well, these were, back in Doc Levins and our time, these were our sports heroes. Our sports heroes had a gut, and they had their hands down their pants there. But I'll tell you something, they didn't get hurt. I'll tell you that much. Okay, this is the modern sports athlete there, and he looks an awful lot like Brian Murer. I don't know, maybe Brian with hair, but anyway.
You're bad, Joe.
All right, so I thought I'd start out discussing my my biases there a little bit. First of all, like I said, I am an athletic trainer. It's the European equivalent of a sports physio. We deal with the care and prevention of athletic injuries. I'll tell you, as time went by, I found that doing rehabilitation with athletes became more and more remedial physical education. I found myself doing the things that others didn't seem to be willing to do or take the time to do, and I found that again, I don't work with elite athletes. I deal with young developing athletes, and more I was finding as the years went by that these young athletes were over specialized and they were missing fundamental movement skills. The other thing is, again, I don't have any power to heal there. I can't fix things, and this is kind of like this is sort of like the medical model, isn't it? The mechanical approach, that something's broken, and you need to go in and isolate it and try to fix it. What I try to do is, from a biotensegrity perspective, is set up the scaffolding for healing to take place. Important to understand the biotensegrity, our operating system. It's never turned off. We don't have to worry about activating the core or activating the glutes. Or getting a certain muscle to fire there. We know that a lot of these movements in athletics take place outside of the level of the central nervous system and occur right at the muscle or joint level themselves. So, based on all the above, I'm asking the question, how much could I get for free? How could I exploit those ground reaction forces, momentum, gravity, and to help me move as efficiently as possible? That person that's throwing there on the upper right, they're not using the ground efficiently. There are a lot of issues in the mechanics that are discussion for another time. So some of my concepts. Important to understand that there is no biotensegrity exercise, and there is no fascia exercise. You are what you train to be. Someone earlier asked the question about, is it possible to overdevelop the fascia system? Yes, that could absolutely happen. This person down there, they're pulling a lot of weight behind them, and look at their body mechanics there. Is that conducive to running fast, or are you just training yourself to run slower with heavy weights? All right, like Sue Lowell says, everything moves. So if you understand biotensegrity, you understand that there are no anchors or fulcrums in the body to work off of. So this is a traditional exercise for the subscapularis muscle, but in real life, if you're throwing or swimming, that subscapularis is working three-dimensionally, and depending in in what plane that you're talking about, the frontal sagittal transverse, it could be contracting it eccentrically, concentrically. and even isometrically, all at the same time, depending on what direction you're talking about. The other thing is that you got to remember the rib cage is moving, the scapula is moving, the humerus is moving, the cervical joints are moving for sure, just for starters. So we really don't have that that boat and mast complex that that Vleeming spoke of, back in the early 70s. The idea that of muscles creating shapes and the body creating shapes that enable it to move efficiently through space is important. And if you look at some of the interventions that are effective, like yoga, Pilates, Alexander technique, Feldenkrais, they all Tai Chi. They're all really creating shapes. And there was a famous study that was done, it was about 10 years ago now, where they compared traditional shoulder rehabilitation to yoga, some of the yoga postures. And it's no surprise that actually yoga turned out to be more effective. So as much as possible, we want to choose those whole body strategies. Rehabilitate, again, create that scaffolding. I already know what you can't do. The surgeon already gave me the guidelines. I want to know what you can do. Again, I have no power to heal. We want to integrate that joint or that injured part of the body in with the rest of the body and allow it's going to heal itself. Some interventions there. Isolated integration, where in the beginning we have an injured joint, like say a knee. We're going to integrate it with the rest of the body. We're going to kind of do some exercises they're going to take the stress off, but it's still integrated with the body. Later on, integrated isolation, we're going to, we want to put a little more stress on its friends. The rest of the Biotensegrity system is always there, but we're just kind of stressing that, that one joint or that one muscle a little bit more. It's a good way to, this strength training as coordination training with appropriate resistance is a good way to look at strength training. So you don't run into those issues where you're creating this strength that's specifically designed for the weight room and stays in the weight room. All right. We're designing these programs. We don't need to worry about so much about sets and reps, but just kind of within that framework, creating as much variability as we can in the athlete's repertoire. Constraint-based training, create movement puzzles for the body. Give the body a task to figure out. Change some of the constraints around it. And just kind of watch what the body does. If the body zigs, when you really expect it to zag, well, is it something that's a normal part of the body's movement signature, or is there something else going on? Again, the Wilbur and some of the other, and Brian, they were talking about before, they were talking about auxeticity, fluidity in movement. Yeah, and those kind of these rhythmic type of exercises, these different skips and hops, and these coordination type exercises seem to be something that's indigenous to all cultures, and it's important to include it. I just have some of the people that influenced me. We all stand on the shoulders of giants for sure. And again, happy birthday, Doc Levin. And Doc, I have to ask you, do you plan on doing your one-arm push-ups for your birthday? Because I know you always do that. That's it. Thank you. Please stop sharing here.
Thank you so much, Joe, for very interesting presentation. I think we are all on the same line, and you said some very interesting things that, and I don't want to sort of steer the audience to questions. But I think for our discussion, I would like to start by just highlighting a few things that you said, which I think fits the whole concept around biotensegrity, whole concept around the principle of biotensegrity. And I look at biotensegrity from a clinical perspective as a principle. And I said it, and I think Dr. Levin would be, I guess, the best guard here to say that I think biotensegrity is a principle similar to gravity, you know, and principles, if you have things that are based on principles, is much more, I think, versatile in terms of application of a principle, rather than getting into the one size cookie sort of one size fits all concept, which is what a lot of training programs, a lot of coaching programs are. Some coaches learn a concept and they take it and they have 5 athletes and the 5 athletes get the same thing. And we know that doesn't work always. The other concept that I want to bring up in your discussion is about, you talk about the body is not a machine. And yes, it's not, and it's not a robot. I use a similar concept and say that if you design a robot to take up an apple from a desk, that's all it's going to do, is to take the apple from the desk and put it maybe on another desk. If you have the apple on a shelf higher up, the robot will not be able to do that. And that's machine. Machine doesn't have that instant adaptability that we are designed for. And the other concept we look at is that the way people look at this whole concept about machines, we are so tuned into machine, is that we think people fix us. And you said it in your presentation. Okay, I'll go to the doctor and he's going to fix me. And I tell my patients, well, this is not a mechanic shop. You're not dropping your car off here and let me fix it and then you come and pick it up. And so the idea that for me is about trying to change people's attitude around this, around their health, is that they are the ones who have to do the work. They're the ones who have the intuition to be able to make the changes in the body that they're willing to do. So I think these are very important points that I'd like our audience to sort of pick up on as we continue into our discussion. So, Joe, I have a question for you. And then I'll leave it to the rest of the panel to pick up on the discussion. You talked about eccentric and concentric contraction, and you also talked about the thing about, we know everything moves, but how does the body generate these internal forces to allow things to move and at the same time maintain some integrity? How would you explain that to our audience?
Well, I think that if you look at that concept of the body, you know, creating shapes, and to be able to, you know, to maintain that shape, and the ability to transition from one shape to the other, I think that's what's I think that's what's going to you know, to add robustness to the system. Does that make sense? So in other words, you know, what I'm saying, Wilbur, is maybe we're not really generating that force. We're just maintaining a certain shape, and the type of training that we do allows us to maintain that better. I guess the term that that'd be good to use is postural strength. Maybe might be a good term to use. You know, and then, like I said, it's those outside forces, you know, and our own intention that are going to allow us to accomplish the task. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, that makes some sense. We know the fact that the forces in the body are internal and there are external forces acting on the body. And as a result of what Dr. Levin talks about, the concept about, you know, the shifting of the center of mass, shifting in terms of creating momentum and creating movement. And we know we can't have movement without intention. So that makes sense, but still yet the body, I think, has to, you know, maintain a certain integrity, and we have the tensegral internal forces existing. And we also have to produce this effective fluid type of movement. So the mechanism for doing that is what I think comes from the fact of the aesthetic behavior of our tissue, the behavior of soft matter in the way that is able to store energy, in the way that is able to adapt and respond to internal forces and the force fields that exist. And I always use the word force fields because I don't really think we can go and draw lines. We have resultant forces for certain things in the body, but I think the whole concept around aesthetic behavior has to deal with force fields and based on the makeup of the collagen and the connective tissue, whatever we're made up of. So, is there anybody from the panel who, Brian, you have anything you'd like to add to this?
Sure, I think to bring the lens back around to athletics, Jen was right when she brought up the point, and Joe just did too, about robustness. I mean, if you're talking about athletics and measuring athletic performance, what are the key KPIs or key performance indicators that we look at when we're evaluating athletic performance? One is, can you show up on the field? Two, can you generate force, a lot of force, particularly most sports, a lot of force in a small amount of time, right? And can you do that accurately, right? So if you have an accuracy-based sports like, you know, throwing a cricket ball or throwing an American football, this is biotensegrity rolls into all of these sports things. And for me, when people get to my office, it's particularly about they've lost the ability to adapt, they've lost their robustness, and there's been an injury. And so when we apply biotensegrity so when you apply the lens of biotensegrity to sport and sport injury, you always have to ask yourself, and I don't think enough practitioners really have explored the idea themselves of what is an injury, what really leads to tissue failure. And you know, if we talk about, you know, Dr. Levin's initial writings, the body can withstand a lot of force, you know, in the original writings, he talks about, you know, 100 kilogram snatch would, maybe that's Grakowski, but 100 kilogram snatch would crush the disc and tear all the erector spinae, and we know that's not true because people do that routinely. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the nature of an injury? When do we get tissue failure? And if I'm not a researcher, Jen, or anything like that, but if we do some mental gymnastics, we have to get to a point of, well, there has to be some shearing moments. And we know there are no shearing moments in biotensegral systems. So how do we get to shearing moments? And I think when Dr. Levin spoke about this idea of, you know, auxetic expansion, auxetic contraction, and I've done talks on this before, I think if we spend too much time in either or state, the cells of the connective tissue actually densify the connective tissue. And I think that opens the door to shearing moments. And so we can talk a lot about the auxetic behavior of tendons, because it's been proven that's the way Achilles tendons act. They act auxetically. And so, you know, we would expect an Achilles tendon when it lengthens to expand. But that's, you know, in some tendons we see when they lengthen, they actually shrink in diameter. Well, that's a non-auxetic behavior. And so maybe that should be our lens on how we're, you know, seeing how we get tissue failure, how we get tissue maladaptation, lack of force production, and lack of accuracy. Those are my things, how I apply biotensegrity to sports.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, and yes, you have some important points in terms of aesthetic behavior of tissue, but and one of the things that, well, I think we'll come back to that. I want to hear from Jen. Jen, do you have anything you'd like to add to this discussion about, you know, creating forces within the body and how we're able to maintain the integrity? Jen?
Sorry, I was stuck on mute. for me, there's two really interesting points that have come out of that. And I just want to pick up on something I think Joe mentioned and also Wilbur. I have to say, kind of coming from the background I have and the training I've had, and I'm sure a couple of the other practitioners are the same, you know, the way we're taught anatomy and exercise is that we want to box exercises. So, you know, we are told this is the best exercise to work this muscle, this is the best exercise to work this muscle. And it's just simply not correct, but it's still being taught, and it's quite a hard concept to let go of. And I think what's interesting is that something that both Joe and Wilbur have said, you know, we respond to movement. The body enjoys movement, and it enjoys movement challenges. And I know someone's posted a question about how do we see this changing athletic conditioning. And for me, the shift in athletic conditioning and sports training will be the reflection of training movement and not training muscles, which I'm sure we'll come back to a little bit later. But to answer your question, Wilbur, so my research has predominantly been with recreational runners, and recreational runners, the typical figures for injuries per year are between 60 to 80% per annum, which is incredibly high. And again, I think, you know, from a research perspective, we have a tendency to want to say, it's an isolated problem at the ankle that leads to injury, or it's an isolated problem at the hip. I know Joe mentioned the glutes earlier. We are obsessed with strengthening the glutes, and people telling people they've got weak glutes as if one day they've just stopped working. But we ultimately are, you know, obsessed with trying to fix isolated problems, where, you know, the reality is, if you look at a recreational runner, one of the key problems they have is they're probably just not conditioned to withstanding that amount of force over multiple steps, over multiple miles. And that for me is the biggest problem. It's nothing to do with movement patterning per se. It's more, we haven't given them, or we haven't taught them the optimal conditions to make the best use of that biotensegrity framework and therefore dissipate forces. So for example, just for sake of ease, I've been measuring force at the knee in recreational runners. And if you look at all the literature around force, in particular, I've been looking at acceleration, but for ease, we'll just go with force. Ultimately, most of the scientific literature says our job, if we want to retrain someone's gait pattern or their running pattern to minimize injury risk, is to reduce the amount of force. Well, you flip that coin and you look at most trained athletes, and they are putting a lot of force into that body, but what they're doing better is they have the tissue condition to dissipate that force. They are making use of that elastic energy, and they are making use of those tissues that are helping to dissipate force. Our recreational runners don't do that because they haven't got that tissue condition. So I suppose, you know, the biggest turning point for me over the last couple of years has been trying to move away from whatever I was taught about anatomy many years ago, and trying to move away from what I was taught about injury risk and prehabilitation, and actually just focusing on tissue conditioning. And that might look like lots of different things. So Joe mentioned constraints-based training. It might look like barbell training, weight training, or whatever you want to call it, but it doesn't necessarily mean there is the best exercise to get the best outcome in people. It's just conditioning those tissues to be able to repeatedly and optimally dissipate that force. And I think we can set, so I'm coming from a gait retraining or running retraining perspective, I think we can teach people the best conditions to optimize that force dissipation. But certainly it isn't going to come from picking one exercise or strengthening the glutes or increasing ankle dorsiflexion, which is some of the common risk factors we talk about.
Thank you, Jane. I agree with you, but I'm going to throw something in here before. So there's something that I love that I think Joe or Brian said it about gluteal activation. And if I tell my therapist here, if I hear them say about glute activation anymore, I'm just going crazy, because It's not so much about activating again one isolated muscle. It's about, for me, I don't know if I caught you right. You talk about, it's about movement patterns to me in terms of the whole body being moved and the timing and the sequence. Because if you look at people, for example, walking, most people don't step properly when they're walking. They don't lift their legs. And we are designed when we walk into to create the elasticity and to be efficient, is that when you lift your legs, it allows your center of mass to transfer. It allows to create that momentum. It also allows that elastic concept in your pelvis to kind of store the energy and release the energy so you can keep moving forward. And by design, in the forest, we can't walk or drag our feet along the ground. We'll stumble and fall. So we are designed for this type of patterning. And you can't just get that just by activating your glutes. Your glutes, yes, are important. But it's not done by isolating it. It has to be done with the whole body in terms of its activation and the way that you should activate that pattern. We can't look at the body as a single segment. We have to look at movement. We have to train movements and movement patterns. That's something I'd like to add in. The other thing is that you talk about conditioning, which I really think is important because conditioning leads to the fatigue factor. When people are fatigued, when tissues are fatigued, that we have to think about the neurological component, right? Neurological fatigue, and there is, fatigue of our tissues, then our patterns of movement changes. And so I think conditioning, most people who, for injuries, they have fatigue, their movement pattern changes, they break down, then I think the tissues get overstressed, the biotensegral forces are not effective, they're not efficient. You cannot use as many, or you cannot use the elastic components as much. So then you have some issues in terms of effective, what I call effective, efficient application of forces. So tissues have to be conditioned for that. And doing that is important, because I look at it in the sense that if I want, when someone is walking, for example, they put about 6 to 7 times the body weight. I could be wrong, in every time the ground reaction forces in terms of the forces that they will put into the ground. If you put a scale on the ground and you measure it, it's going to be 5 to 6 times the body weight. When somebody's running, it's up to 11 to 15 times, depending on how fast you're running. The thing is that this is a lot of force, external force through the body. If the body is not designed to take that force repetitively, then we have an issue. And this is how I describe injury. So it's like having a basin that can only hold so much water, and then you have 5 gallons, but then you take a 10-gallon bucket and trying to fill that 5-gallon basin, you're going to overflow with stress. And this, for me, is one of the precursors for injury, is that we are not, as you said, conditioned in terms of taking that repetitive load, and the tissues break down. So training has to reflect that. The training has to reflect that conditioning. But in that process, if you ignore the technique or the movement pattern, I think we have a problem. So I think we have to have both. We have to have proper technique patterns that's going to help to generate elasticity in an efficient and an effective way, and at the same time, continue to condition the tissue so that they can adapt to these high loads. Because connective tissue, based on the concept around mechanotransduction, will adapt to taking load. Bone will grow thicker in areas that it has to take load. The forces of alignment in bone are present in more dense arrangement where the load seems to be greater. So we know those things happen. So this is very interesting, I think, stuff our audience can ask a question. But I think the terms of the activation about glutes, this is something I'd like us to discuss a little bit about. I don't know if anybody else have any other questions or comments about that topic. Joe?
No, as you're talking, Wilbur, I was thinking, but before I get to that, an important concept I think that Brian has brought up in the past that I don't think he mentioned today was that's really important, that in a biotensegrity system, it's important to understand that bone can also produce force. It has a stored kinetic energy, to it, provided, like you said, Wilbur, that it's trained and conditioned properly. And there was a study done. I don't have it available right now. I have to look it up. But it was done on runners that have so-called shin splints. Okay, which is there's no such thing really. It's a stress fracture of the medial tibia. And what they did was somebody had the idea, you know what, let me look at the rest of the body and see what's going on with the skeletal system. Well, sure enough, these stress fractures, in a good percentage of these athletes were showing up in other bones, especially, interestingly enough, the sacrum. So it shows us, something really, interesting about force distribution to the body and what really is producing and attenuating force. So, all right. So getting back to the whole thing with the with glute activation, look, in my opinion, for what I see in my athletes, when I see somebody with I guess what I would call like a dormant butt, it's usually caused by, in society today, we sit on it too much. It's a modern problem. And when you sit on your butt too much, which has something that the pelvis that has the largest part of the muscles in the body coming off of it there, they're going to be deconditioned. And that deconditioning is going to affect the entire body. And it's easy to see, like you mentioned, watching recreational runners and then watching the elite runners. And one thing you'll see is that, that body the pelvis falling out in the frontal plane, Trendelenburg sign, which the body cannot attenuate forces. But again, it's not just the butt, and it's the whole entire body. So I don't know if that helps.
Thanks, Joe. This is all so interesting. And you'll see that we've got video cameras turning on again now. We've invited our audience to turn on their videos because there's lots of questions coming in and we want to hear from them as well. One of the big things that we love in the Biotensegrity parties is the interaction that we get with each other. One of our visions, one of our purpose of this is to create community, as Wilbur so outlined so well in his very beginning with that slide. So Susan, I think you've got a list of the questions in the order they came in.
Yeah, and I'm
before we go to the questions, Susan, before we go to the questions, can I just summarize one thing? And this will just open up for more discussion from our panel and also for the people who are asking questions. The term I want to bring in here is something I considered in keeping with the forces of nature. And Steve always talks about, well, you have to abide by the principles of thermodynamics and the principles of gravity. There is something that I call dynamic stability. In other words, I don't believe that anything is stable. Nothing is stable and everything moves. But we need a certain amount of stability to be able to increase and work with integrity to get motion and to get fluidity. So this is something out there. I may be describing it wrong, but it's something out there for important discussion among our panelists and our audience. Okay, you go ahead. You go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, so our first question is from Stella Maris. I'm not sure, I'm sure I'm not saying her name correctly. She's in Brazil. She can unmute if she wants, but maybe she's not there. So she wants to know about fascia and overtraining. How can we know how much intensity, how many rounds, and thank you.
Okay, who wants to take that question? Brian, Joe?
Wilbur, give me 1 second just to say something out. I'm gonna now allow everybody to be unmuted if you want to talk and ask your questions, but I'm gonna ask you to please keep yourself muted if you are not talking, okay? So I'm gonna change the setting now so you can unmute yourself if you want to, but please keep yourself muted if you are not asking a question, okay?
Okay, all right. Which member of the panel would like to address this question? Very, very interesting question. Overtraining, frequency, and so forth.
Well, I think Joe referred back to the question earlier, but to kind of pick up on Joe's point, you know, we're talking about reps and sets and intensities here, and that's kind of, I suppose, part of the problem with the existing framework in conditioning is, again, we want to box everything into, if you do this many reps and sets, it's going to have this particular outcome. The body likes stress, but it can be overstressed as well. And I suppose, going back to the question, can you overtrain fascia? Well, yeah, because you can overtrain systems if you do too much of the repeat or similar exercises with too much intensity. So I suppose it's not a simple question to answer in terms of you just take the reps down or you take the intensity down. It's more about variability in training and not overtraining the same movements at the same intensity, or not training the I suppose it's like I said, creating variability in movement as opposed to just overtraining the same movement patterns over and over again. Because we respond to stress, and of course, if you overstress a system, it will result in injury.
Well, I think the danger here is, you know, it's just like Steve talked about a few weeks ago. And what's the fuss about fascia is, if we start siloing tissues and start siloing systems, then we sort of lose the forest for the trees. I mean, remember, we're talking about athletics here. There are a ton of different biomotor qualities. There are a ton of different qualities when we're evaluating an athlete, and connective tissue is just one. We really can't take throw the sarcomeres out with the connective tissue bathwater, right? When we talk about overtraining, there's biochemical, biomechanical, there's psychological. So I think when you talk about connective tissue in of itself in relationship to the athlete, you have to monitor the athlete as a whole. And, you know, my good friend Eric Coram at William & Mary does a lot about how to monitor athletes for overtraining. So remember, the connective tissue is just one single part of the whole.
Well, Joe, I would I agree with you in terms of it comes back down to monitoring. I mean, there's been some work done on looking at the turnover rate of connective tissue in terms of loading it when it's most vulnerable in terms of injury, post-training, and it's somewhere between 36 and 48 hours that there is, that if you train right after, you know, after heavy, intense exercise, if you go the next day as opposed to waiting those 48 hours or 36 hours, that you will create more damage because the connective tissue is in a stage of regeneration. We know that happens because we know that there's micro tearing, there's breakdown of the tissue, there's the physiological response. But I mean, it's something that I think depends on every individual responds to stress differently. It's like our fingerprint. We're not the same. And this is one of the beauties about coaching, is that coaches have that ability to read the body. When I talked about that FET before, where we can read the emotion, the form, right? We can read the body of the athlete. And that's why being present with an athlete or being able to read your patients in terms of, you know, what are they presenting with? How fatigued do they look? What does the body expression look like? What's the energy look like? It's very important. And I think what's his name, Philip Shepard in the Radical Wholeness, he talks about some of the whole energy connections that people have to have with the patients. You need to have that, and some coaches have that kind of a concept with the athlete, you know. So you can overtrain tissue. There's always a balance in terms of how much you do. When do you have to back off? They have to create that balance, and that's an art. This is where training is not just a science, but it's an art. It's like an artist creating. You have to get into the system. You cannot be a coach and just be out there. You have to be in there, in yourself and in the patient, in your client. Okay. Any other comment? Another question?
We have a question from. We have a number of questions. So Lisa Babiuk is next.
Thanks, Susan. My question is, I wrote it in the chat. So my experience with working with this model, I get very different results. I work with baseball players primarily, a little bit of hockey. So with your work, how do you see working with Biotensegrity changing the face of sports and performance?
Who would like to take that? Or okay, I'll give my. Somebody wants to, of the panel? Anybody wants to go first?
Okay, well, I work with I work with baseball a lot, and I work with baseball a lot in the past. I think the problem it's hard to say it's just one thing, but I think it gets to Wilbur's point that it really comes down to a lot of it comes down to coaching again, and this whole over specialization in baseball players. If you look at from a tensegrity point of view, and if you look at some of the pitchers of the past, like Bob Gibson and those guys, I mean, Bob Gibson, he could throw multiple days, I mean, without any rest. I'd be scared to go out to the mound and take the ball from Bob Gibson, in fear that he just kind of like that he'd throw the ball at me or something. But the difference is you got to remember like what kind of a background they had growing up in elementary school. There was a lot of climbing and that type of thing, and climbing and overhead ladders and and things like that, climbing in trees. The overhead rings and that type of thing, and from a young age. So again, the arms and the hands are very powerful. Being away from the center of the body, and all the soft tissue, bone, the neural tissue, all of that has been strengthened. It's robust. So when I work with baseball a lot, one of the things I would try to do is kind of like again, create these overhead movement puzzles, and let kids play. If they weren't strong enough to actually hang and walk hand to hand on the overhead ladders, I'd have, like, for instance, I had like a thing. I'd have them sit down on the ground, put their feet up on a scooter, and then grab these overhead ropes so their body would be kind of like an L position, sort of, with their butts off the ground, and then with their hands overhead, kind of like pull themselves along like this overhead net made out of rope, and pulling all different types of planes in different directions and different speeds, and to gradually kind of build up that that fingernail to hip connection and robustness and strength. Does that help with your question, Lisa?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe even a broader perspective of, do you feel that there would be less incidence of injury? What kind of shift would we see in performance exceeding where athletes are now? That kind of
Okay.
to me, it's very exciting when I look at that, the possibilities of the efficiency and performance, and that athletes aren't plagued by injury, career-ending injury, that kind of thing.
Well,
Wilbur, can I take this?
yeah.
I think this is, we're still, Steve I think he'll tell you, we're still in early days in terms of clinical application of biotensegrity. And so, I think one of the things that can change high-level human performance is take its place as a principle and act as a lens the way people can look at athletes. And again, if you look at athletes in the terms of distribution of load and production of force in a smart way, that's how it can change. Jen talked about this question of stiffness. Wayan and Clark, who are the premier researchers in speed production, talk about ground reaction forces, and basically all you have to do is hit the ground as hard as you can and you're going to run fast. Well, and so they're talking about generating stiffness in the lower shank and the leg. Well, the Swedes took that too far in the early 2000s, and you can see this in the documentary called The Price of Gold. They were generating stiffness in whatever way they could to hit the ground as hard as they could, and they had all kind of, soft tissue injuries, stress fractures and things like that. And that's why this concept, again, of auxeticity is important. You can generate stiffness in a biotensegral manner and increase the loads that you can handle without incurring injury. So, Lisa, I think it'll take its rightful place as a lens to look at sports through.
I think, Joe, I think this is a very important point that you make, and it's the whole concept of how biotensegrity is that it's going to inform people to do what I call stop doing empty exercising. It's like you're eating food that doesn't have any nutritional value. Because people have to understand, and the concept you use about the sweets, I knew about that what happened there also. Because the idea is that they don't, yes, you have to hit the ground hard if you're running, you have to apply force, but they don't understand, they miss the other concept of it, which is what's the placement of the foot when you're hitting the ground? How are you going to accentuate and enhance the biotensegrity principles to use them to your advantage? And they weren't doing that. If you're hitting the ground hard with a plantar flex foot, you're going to create some external torsional stresses and stuff that's you're going to have injuries. If you're hitting the ground hard with a dorsiflex, where you put the foot under tension, where you allow the aesthetic behavior of the Achilles to act, you're not going to generate those forces. You're going to have efficient forces, elastic forces, and elastic release of energy. And it's about getting people to understand it will help to decrease injury. I've seen it in my practice. I've seen it on working on teams. When coaches get it, they can play more. They can become a better artist. They'll start using the right combination of paints to make the picture and to get what they want out of the athletes. So this concept, for all the coaches I've introduced it to, high-level coaches, it's incredible of the benefit that they get from it in terms of the aha moment. Now I understand why I'm doing this and why it works. Even if they figure it out by experience, now they can play more. They can put more into the application.
So related to that, you just talked about auxetic behavior, Wilbur, and Carol Boggs is watching on YouTube, and she wants to know how Brian would give a definition of auxetic behavior.
Brian?
Well, it's what's the very definition of Poisson's ratio, right? Classically, when you pull a material apart, it gets thinner, but a material with a negative Poisson's ratio, as you pull it apart, it actually gets thicker. And so like I say, all tensegrity structures are auxetic, but not all auxetic structures are tensegritous. So Poisson's ratio, and Steve can correct me if I'm wrong, relates to all tensegritous structures. So, and again, you think, auxetic material expands as it's lengthened. It also contracts and organizes as it's shortened too.
Condensing,
yeah. And then you get in these ideas of Oobleck and, right, Susan, and soft tissue matter. And again, like I said, we're in early days of applying biotensegrity clinically, and it's the question of applying architecture to biology. It's going to take more people like Jen who are smarter than me to figure out how to apply it clinically efficiently.
Yeah. Well, at aesthetic, you're going to say something, Joe?
No.
Okay. The aesthetic concept, depends on the organization of the hydrogen bonds, if you want to get, and the glycosaminoglycans within the tissue. That's the beauty about the biology, and because that arrangement is so infinite in its arrangement, and the chilarity and the direction that these glycosaminoglycans are in the system. This is why when you pull stuff, when you pull a material that you expect it to thin, it actually widens because you're bringing those bonds closer together, and the negative charges don't want to be close together. They repel each other because there are these big hydraulic groups within the glycosaminoglycans and the water, the structuring of water. So your aesthetic behavior depends on the structuring of water and the glycosaminoglycans, both the non-sulfated and the protein glycosaminoglycans. And that's why the whole body is aesthetic. And it's a beautiful design to maintain shape, maintain form, and at the same time maintain some efficiency in movement. Because if you think about it, if you have I use this example, if you have a car axle or something and it cracks, if you apply force, it will break. The body is not designed like that. If one area of the body is sort of sticky and it's not moving properly, and you apply force, it will redistribute the force somewhere else. I mean, that's the versatility of design in our system. And the whole idea of redundancy and the whole idea of symmetry and stuff. And that's why Neil book, you got to read Neil's book if you know, it helps, it puts it all together.
All right. And we do have Neil here, but we've got a few more questions. So yeah, so Fiona wants to know, can you talk more about, this is for Joe, she says, can you talk more about shin splints being stress fractures? Is it possible to have periosteal bone inflammation due to excessive load without stress fracture?
The short answer, no, it's a lot of BS. A friend of mine Eric Nussbaum, has some unpublished research where he looked at that issue in high school runners, and in almost 100% of the time on MRI, they did turn out to be either stress fractures or cortical changes in the bone. In other words, soon to be stress fractures. So when you do see it, stop worrying about so much about what the foot is doing. It's a full body force attenuation issue. Back off, and just because you're a runner doesn't mean that you have to run every day. All right. So what I do with those, again, I take the focus off the foot. Get them on a spin bike. I take the seat off the spin bike and have them doing sprints on the spin bike that were very specific to the running events that they were going to be doing. I do a lot of full body strength training. First just with body weight, and then adding sandbags to it, and then we'd add in lots of coordination type exercise, running mechanics type of drills. You don't have to run every day. Those are just some of the issues. It's kind of, I guess, a discussion for another time. But remember, no such thing as shin splints or periosteal irritation. That's just, if it does happen, it's just a side effect. Shin splints, medial tibial stress syndrome equals stress fracture.
All right, thank you, Joe. But Joe, I kind of don't agree with you totally there. Because I think there's a certain level, I don't call it, I believe to shin splints is a waste paper basket for that. I don't know what's wrong with you. And that's what most doctors would do. Oh, you have leg pain, you have shin splints. And then next thing I know, the person have a stress fracture, which the leg is almost severing. I just had one the other day and I sent it for a bone scan, and yes, they have a stress fracture. So, but there's a certain level of stress in the system that will show up before you actually get fractures. I think, and I think that stress, that torsional stress that occur, you're right, it's a whole body system that's causing it to occur. And that point is sometimes one of the weakest points. That's where you feel most of the pain, because it's one of the most unprotected in the sense of having help. So you feel more stress in that area and hence more sensitive. So you can have a certain level of tissue adaptation and tissue sort of alteration before you get into the end result, which I think is a spectrum before you develop the stress fracture. I agree that there's stress fractures, but I don't believe every time you have shin pain, that is a stress fracture. I think there's a gradient. So I don't know if you want to clarify that.
Cortical changes in the bone for sure. I think it has very little to do with soft tissue, and again, especially when it comes to lower extremity, asymmetry is the norm. I just found out, things like pes planus and pronating feet and that type of thing have very little to do with it. And go ahead.
But Joe,
Yeah.
wouldn't you agree that, we've been asked a question, and again, it's a question of application of biotensegrity to sports. A lot of sports are unbalanced and unilateral. Say, a discus thrower or a cricket bowler, discus throwers will have a adapted scoliosis, and if you kind of understand distribution of load, you don't take the scoliosis away, but you just manage it so you don't have tissue failures. If same thing with a high jumper. We've, Coach Path has had people fix, adaptations to high jumpers, and they can't get off the ground. So, let's kind of pump the brakes a little bit on all of asymmetry. Sometimes just managing asymmetries from a sports lens.
Well, that's true. You see, it's for hurdlers. I don't expect my hurdle to have a straight spine, and I don't expect the hips to be level. It's just not going to happen. So let's go to another question because yeah, there's maybe some interesting stuff.
Another question, but also sort of related. Shear has come up a few times. This concept of shear. My understanding of how the biotensegral system works is that shear doesn't arise because it gets forces get passed through the system. So as long as everything's working right. But I think this also has to do with the feet that just came up and degeneracy and redundancy. So I'm wondering if Jen could weigh in.
Yeah, sure. For me, it relates back to something that a few people have mentioned. So we've had movement literacy discussed a little bit earlier, and also constraints and variability training. And I suppose to pick up on a point Brian made, you have athletes who will demonstrate what we would consider to be dysfunctional movement patterns that are going to lead to injury. So asymmetry is something that we routinely assess for, have assessed for historically. And in my mind, the athletes who don't get injured are the ones who have the movement repertoire to be able to manage what we would consider to be those dysfunctional patterns. So what I mean by that is, if I have a runner who hits an unstable surface, or hits a change in the surface level, for example, they have the movement capacity or movement repertoire to be able to manage that change in terrain. Whereas an unconditioned athlete, an unconditioned runner, might not have that repertoire available. So one thing that John and I have talked about in the paper is this notion of degeneracy. And degeneracy is effectively, you have movement options, you have movement variability. So when one thing fails, there is another option available to you. And I think the best athletes, the ones that are least injury prone, are the ones that can harness or access that movement degeneracy. So constraints-based training, where you give the body puzzles to work out. So I think Joe was talking about getting people hanging and moving their arms and swinging off things, is something that gives the body a puzzle, but also teaches, and sorry, this is quite a layman's way of explaining it, but this is the best way I can think of explaining it, is it teaches your body that it's got movement availability. And this kind of comes back to one of the things we spoke about with the glutes earlier and the dormant glutes. We sit down a lot. We just don't know how to access some of these muscles because we're sat down, we're in a particular position over a period of time, etc. So I think you know, if you're able to create movement options for people by applying things like constraints-based conditioning, or you show the body that it has options to move in lots of different ways, that's going to minimize the number of injuries that potentially someone can sustain. And I think it kind of comes back to this whole thing with you have to show the body that it's robust. I don't know the answer to that, by the way. I know some people are going to ask, how would you condition the body to robust? But I think part of it is just being able to give the body options, or to explore those options through different training mechanisms, such as those that Joe's discussed. Did that answer your question? Sorry, I think I went off on a bit of a tangent there as well.
No, I think what we have to do, though, we've got so many questions. We're trying to get to as many as possible. Do you mind if I move on to the next one?
Move on to the next one. I think what she said is perfect. It's about variability. So
yeah, great. Elizabeth Larkham has a question. Elizabeth, do you want to unmute?
Thank you, Susan, for the invitation. I'm happy to. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So enjoying the conversation. Hi, Wilbur and
Hello.
other friends.
Hello.
Yes, please would you comment on the efficacy of blood flow restriction training from the standpoint of biotensegrity and its effect on the quality of the robustness of the tissues, the ability to withstand force, and its effect, beneficial or not, on creating whole body movement flow.
All right. Who want to take this from our panel?
I guess I could get it started because I experimented with it a little bit. The blood flow restriction, you got to be careful with it. I mean, especially now in the COVID environment with the risk of the blood clots, of course. But that that aside, it seems to be pretty safe. The problem that I found is that the fatigue sets in very early, with the blood flow restriction, and it interferes with the coordination. So again, if it's, then you really become focused on, muscle strength and on hypertrophy, and you're kind of getting away from the neural quality of exercise. And I don't know, it kind of like defeats the purpose. Maybe it has some use with with arthrogenic inhibition. With those of you that aren't familiar with that concept, it happens after it's very commonly happens in the knee after ACL surgery. The quadriceps shut down; they keep atrophying, shrinking more and more, and and then you get to the point where oh shoot, what do I do? And the blood flow restriction training, when it comes to that, it will help hypertrophy the quads. From a biotensegrity point of view, I guess I'm not a fan, again, because of it's not influencing the coordination, and if it's not doing that, then I kind of lose it.
Yeah.
So anyone else?
Yeah, Joe, I agree with you on that point. And in addition, what I would add, I mean, I have experiment with that too, because it was brought to my attention. I was in Europe one year. Is that I think it may benefit somebody who is doing weightlifting, and yes, you see quad adaptation. Again, those adaptation is based on stress being placed on the body, but it's not a dynamic system. If we have an ACL reconstruction and we want to create strong fluid motion and movability, we cannot be doing static type of things. We have to do mobility type of things. We have to do movement. The body is very specific in the way.
Okay, thanks. Sorry for interrupting here, Wilbur. We've got 6 minutes left. Susan, how many more questions do we have? And how are we going to manage this? Do we ask questions and limit the answers, or?
Well, no, we've got a lot of really fascinating comments in the chat, but they're not necessarily questions.
Okay.
So I think we've pretty much.
How about this one? I'd be interested, because I'm interested as well. There was a comment about asymmetry in Usain Bolt, and I would be interested to ask Wilbur how much he would adapt gait in athletes if all seems to be going well, despite seeming awkward.
Yes, and I've heard Joe talk about that too, that same subject. So, and of course, we've got Neil here who's written the book on symmetry. So
maybe it should be a whole new episode, Symmetry and Asymmetry.
Maybe we should talk about that. I think that would be an important thing. I'll tell you that you do not adapt. You're not looking for evenness or symmetry in an athlete, because each movement pattern is designed for certain things. A shot putter is going to have a certain movement pattern. Scoliosis, a javelin thrower, they're going to have certain shapes and certain distortions. And when you look at them walk down the street, you're going to say, oh my gosh, I have to fix this person. I had an athlete, an Olympic athlete, a gold medalist once, and I wasn't with him in Europe, and somebody had to see him and they says, oh, let's, man, your hips are all the way like this, and let's, we have to straighten up your hips. And you know what? They messed him up. It took us a few months to get him back on track in terms of what they were trying to do, because he was there for about 4 weeks. It's not about that. You have to look at patterns, not static, plumb line things. It does not matter when somebody's moving, and again, even in evaluation, I didn't show you this slide, but when you're evaluating, the whole concept around biotensegrity, when you're evaluating somebody, you have to evaluate them in the way that they are doing their sport. When I evaluate a javelin thrower, it's not the same way I evaluate a runner, because the javelin thrower have torsion. I have to put them in a torsional way, in the way that they deliver in the javelin, to see, well, why are they having chest pain? Why are they having back pain? All right. So you have to understand the sport. You have to understand the mechanics of the sport. And by the way, I have to tell you guys, sports and javelin throwing and hammer throwing is not normal. What's normal for us is climbing trees and running and hunting. All right, doing gymnastics is sort of normal because we're in trees and we're supposed to be that. But, running at high speeds like that, or throwing a javelin, or, it's not necessarily that normal. Well, we used to throw spears and stuff like that. But some sports are not normally what we do. Cycling, for example, that's not normal human behavior, so we have to be careful. No, I do not change. If I understand the sport, my idea is to get movement and efficient movement in the form that they designed. I'm not going to try and make them the straight spine. There's no straight spines. It doesn't matter. What matters is function and dynamic movement.
I wonder if we could get everybody to give really 30-second recap, everybody on the panel, because we've got so many fabulous things that we need to do this again, because we've got questions about golf. I want to know those answers, about how the jaw relates, and Gavin James has ideas about how your mouth and your jaw relate to your whole body movement. We need to have another session, but I wonder if I could just get 15, 20, 30 seconds from each of you as a final thought.
Right, Joe.
Look, I'm just gonna. I thank everyone, in the panel for the great questions that you have, and after I hang up here, I'm just gonna have to digest everything I just heard and rethink that, and rethink how it's going to to fit into what I do. So it's nothing about me. It really has everything to do with everyone else and the great questions everyone asked. So thank you.
Jen?
Oh, Jen, you're muted.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just to follow up from Joe, I think we're in a really exciting time with particularly sports conditioning or conditioning as a whole, because I don't even think we've realised the potential that biotensegrity is going to have on our thinking moving forwards. And I've mentioned this a few times, and I just think it's a really salient point to take away. I think the best athletes and the best movers are the ones that are best conditioned to withstand or dissipate force, and that's because they have uncapped movement. So they have loads of movement options. They've been taught to harness those movement options. And part of the question about conditioning for me is not conditioning someone to be like stronger per se, but conditioning them to have movement options and have movement variability. And we're at a really interesting standpoint with athletic conditioning, because I think more people are buying into variability training and constraint-based training. And the great thing for us is Biotensegrity is a fantastic framework to map over all of that. So I'm really excited to where this could go in the future for definite. So thanks very much for having me.
Wonderful. Brian, is it Brian?
Yeah. So the panel was about sports, and when we think about evaluating high-level sports, it's about generating large amounts of power in a short amount of time. It's about being able to be accurate if you're involved with some sort of implement. And then it's about showing up on time, or like Jen says, robustness. And the way Biotensegrity applies to those is, like Graham says, Biotensegrity are first principles. It has to do with geometry, the geometry of tissue. So once we learn, and we're in the early days, how to apply these first principles in a very clinical way, then we're going to be able to give people tools to apply it better to high-level sport.
Well said.
Yeah, very, very, very well said. And I think if you want to hear anything from me, I think the way I look at it is that it's all around integration. And I think one of the things we have to do as a community is to try and see how we can integrate the rest of the community on health and sports and you know, in terms of working together and trying to understand the concept that, you know, no one person can do it all, and it's not about the person who are given it. We are just conduits. We are conduits to deliver and to advise, you know, our clients in terms of how the body works. We have this new understanding of the body that's highlighted in terms of the body is a whole system, the omnidirectional delivery of force, the idea of the instant and continuous adaptability and the continuity of our tissues. We have to start thinking differently. And if there's anything I want to deliver to our audience today, is to try and be open-minded, read, listen, talk, be receptive, and educate as much as you can. It has to be an integrative approach. We are an integrated system.
Thank you, Wilbur. And what a great message to finish with. And your whole approach of really holistic coaching and rehabilitation, not just Wilbur, but all of us. And what a fantastic discussion we've had, as probably the first of many around sports and biotensegrity, but so many overlaps. We've got things about symmetry that we want to talk about. I want to remind everybody, this is BiotensegriTea Party number 16. So thank you, big thank you to Brian Murer and to Joe Przytula, to Jen Wilson, and to our co-host, Wilbur Kelsek. Great job, all of you. I'm excited to talk more with you. Before we go, we would like to have another station ID. Rachel.
Chris, before you do that, can I just say on behalf of the panelists, we want to thank the Biotensegrity Society and Dr. Stephen Levin, happy birthday. And for all the sponsors, we as practitioners, we'd love to do this kind of discussion. And we thank you for having the foresight and the interest in allowing us to voice some of our concepts and our opinions. So I'm honored, and we are honored to be able to do that.
It's a pleasure. And you know, the Biotensegrity community, it's a growing team. We are a community and we work together. So Rachel, how about a thanks to our sponsors and more about what we're doing here?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So our Biotensegrity Party events are a production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive in Washington, D.C., whose mission includes education and building community. Subscribe to our email list and register to join us next week on Zoom. Download our BX 101 self-study guide to beginning Biotensegrity, and all of this can be found again at biotensegrityarchive.org. We also want to give a huge thanks to our sponsors, our publisher Handspring Publishing in East Lothian, Scotland, who offer everyone in the archive email list a coupon. So thank you, Handspring. Also to Fernando Tajaro and Artifact Pro in Madrid for sponsoring us and supplying our newsletter readers with a coupon code to get a great discount for his wonderful models. We We want to thank Embodied Biotensegrity and Chris for our technical support. A special thank you to the ever flexible and supportive Mariana Barreto for lending us her technical skills. And thanks to the British Fascia Symposium in the UK, which not only organizes their biannual BFS event, but several other exciting programs as well. So we're going to provide links again to all of this in the show notes and also in the chat, which are also further up in the chat from earlier today. If you want to join us on Zoom for future Tea Party events or to get the coupon codes, please join the archive mailing list at biotensegrityarchive.org.
And I want to add another thank you to Lisa Babiak, who's just joined our team, and she's going to be managing our videos and our YouTube channel. Yay, Lisa, thank you so much. Before we close with a second birthday toast maybe for Steve, Susan, can you tell us about next week?
Yeah, next week is going to be a lot of fun. Patricia Hopper has agreed to come on and moderate a kind of panel discussion on teaching and learning biotensegrity. It's something I've been doing a lot of. It's something Chris has been doing a lot of. It's something Doug Johnson's been doing a lot of with musicians all over the world. And so the three of us are going to be talking about doing it and figuring out how to do it and taking questions from everybody about how to go about it. And so we're looking forward to that. And I want to just say personally, thank you to Brian, to Joe, to Jen, and to Wilbur for coming on today. I am so excited about the world of athletics and sports and how biotensegrity is getting out there to them. So thank you.
Susan, there was a question from about the jaw from
about the what?
The jaw, about how does the jaw affect movement, and it is huge, especially in people who are, so that's for another discussion, but tell him there is definite evidence. And
Wilbur,
so it's huge.
Wilbur, that question came from Gavin James. He's
Gavin.
the man who,
oh yes, Gavin, that's right.
He's the man who wrote the book on it.
Yes.
So yes, there's another show.
Yeah.
I was going to think, oh. Okay, so let's finish off with a toast. First of all, thank you to all of our panel guests and our co-host Wilbur. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here, for sharing, and to the Biotensegrity Tea Party team. We are so delighted to find out that as these events continue, we're really learning about the diversity of our community. And I think, Steve, this is our gift to you, to be sharing and spreading biotensegrity in the spirit that you've shared with us, with generosity, with the openness that Wilbur has talked about. So happy birthday, Steve. Thanks all for coming.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Steve. You got to say something.
Yes.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming and for joining my family, which is really what it is now, is a family. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right. Happy birthday.
All right. Happy birthday, Steve.
Happy birthday, Steve.
Cheers. We'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.
I want to know who that guy was behind Joe with the mask on.